And welcome. I'm Andy Hodges, live from ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to our virtual webinar, The Role of Infrastructure in Disaster Risk Reduction. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimbabwe's TV network ZTN and our partners, UN Ops and the World Bank. Now today's webinar will be co-hosted by Jibrila Mazin, Country Manager, UN Ops, and Mukami Kariuki, World Bank Country Manager, Zimbabwe. Now, should you have any comments or views on our program this afternoon, as usual, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zimbabwe's TV network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. Cyclone Idai struck Southeast Africa in March 2019, killing at least 1,300 people in Zimbabwe, Mozambique and Malawi. This was one of the largest and most devastating natural disasters to hit Zimbabwe in our recent history. In Zimbabwe's eastern highlands, the epicenter of Cyclone Idai, apart from the terrible tragedy of lives and loved ones lost, citizens lost their homes, their livelihoods, livestock and crops. On top of these tragic events, children saw their schools and places of learning destroyed. And more significantly, the infrastructure such as roads and bridges was almost completely destroyed. The government of Zimbabwe, together with organizations such as the World Bank, the African Development Bank and UN Ops, poured much needed resources into the affected areas in an effort to build back the massive infrastructure losses that occurred. The World Bank is supporting the Zimbabwe Idai Recovery Project to the tune of $72 million. The African Development Bank is also supporting recovery and resilience through a $25 million fund. 2 years later, it appears, however, that our collective memory of the disaster of Cyclone Idai appears to have faded away. Our webinar today will show you that Cyclone Idai and its devastating effects cannot be forgotten. Don't be mistaken, there is still work to be done. Additional resources need to be put in place so that we can continue concentrating on putting aside and fixing the devastating effects. So please do not forget this. Now today on our webinar we'll show you that Cyclone Idai and its devastating effects, as I said, cannot be forgotten. Additional resources do need to be raised. Today we ask and explore UN Ops specialization in infrastructure and disaster risk reduction, why this conversation is important. What is the role of infrastructure in terms of disaster recovery? We will explore risk-informed and evidence-based approaches to infrastructure development and operationalization of resilient strategies, the gap in disaster risk reduction of infrastructure in Zimbabwe, the need for infrastructure development planning, crucially, the financing for disaster-resilient infrastructure, opportunities and challenges, and finally, mapping the way forward for Zimbabwe. Let's have a look at our first video.
Infrastructure makes it possible to put food on the table. Infrastructure enables access to education and health facilities. Infrastructure allows access to clean water and sanitation. Infrastructure connects communities and provides the gateway for economic development. And when disasters occur, infrastructure plays a big role in the survival of communities. As the frequency and severity of climate-related disasters increases globally due to climate change, it is vital that policymakers and planners adopt evidence-based approaches to improve the resilience of infrastructure systems. Infrastructure, therefore, plays a key role in disaster risk reduction.
That video graphically showed us the role of infrastructure on disaster risk reduction. And of course, the citizens of the eastern highlands of Zimbabwe really appreciate the efforts that are being put in, particularly with the government of Zimbabwe, UN Ops, the World Bank, and of course the African Development Bank, and why we must not forget and in fact redouble our efforts to bring back normalcy to the region. This broadcast, as I said, is brought to you by Zimbabwe's TV network ZTN and our partners, UN Ops and the World Bank. Now today I'm joined in the studio by our distinguished guests and one of my co-hosts. I will introduce them. Honorable Mike Madiro, he's Zimbabwe's Deputy Minister of Transport and Infrastructure Development. Mr. Nathan Nkomo, he's Director of Zimbabwe's Civil Protection Unit. And one of today's co-hosts, Jibrila Mazin, he's Country Manager, UN Ops. And I'm joined in the studio as well by Rob Jones, Infrastructure Advisor with UN Ops. And joining us virtually are my other co-hosts for today, Mukami Kariuki, she's World Bank Country Manager Zimbabwe, and Nicholas Calendar, Disaster Risk Management Specialist at the World Bank. I welcome you all to today's webinar. Remember, we would like to hear from you, so please contact us with your questions, comments or views via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. We will hopefully later on in the program ask your questions directly to our guests or read out your comments. So make sure, please, we hear from you. Now, in our first session, we learn about UN Ops specialization in infrastructure, and we ask, disaster risk reduction, why is this conversation important? I'd now like to welcome one of my co-hosts, Jibrila Mazin. He's country manager at UN Ops, and Mukami Kariuki, World Bank country manager Zimbabwe, to give us some background on the tragedy that we call Cyclone Idai and its effects. Jibrila and Mukami, welcome to our webinar this afternoon. Jibrila, as this session's lead, can you please discuss and explain UN Ops specialization in infrastructure and why this conversation on disaster risk reduction is pertinent?
Sure, thank you. Andy, and good afternoon all. So it's a pleasure, first of all, to be here. Thank you for having us, and for us to be able to present a little bit of the work we're doing along with the government of Zimbabwe, and in the context of really Cyclone Idai recovery. I will start by overall a quick really introduction of UN Ops. UN Ops is the United Nations Office for Project Services. So it's a UN agency that has been created slightly above 25 years ago. It used to be actually a part of UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. And I think the UN member states realized it was important to have an agency that had an implementation capacity to support different member states in three key areas. Really, the mandate that was ratified by the General Assembly was for three specific areas in which UNOPS was required then to specialize in order to then provide expert support to the different governments. Those key areas are, number one, infrastructure, so really the core of what we'll be talking today. The second one is public procurement. And the third one is more cross-cutting, but quite relevant as well in the sense that it's project management, and you need really project management to be able to implement satisfactorily the other two mandates. So it's our headquarters is in Copenhagen, so we're not anymore in New York as the rest of the UN agency. That's, I guess, is more for a cost discussion. And in the region in Africa, we're organized as a sub-region. So there is an Eastern and Southern Africa sub-region where we report to. So our sub-region headquarters, we can say, is in Nairobi in Kenya. So essentially, it's one of the aspects also that I think is important to mention is that UNOPS is a project-based agency. And we have really been created with, it's quite unique in a sense that there is no other UN agency that is project-based that does not receive core funding from the member states. So really the services of UNOPS are on demand basis. We're here based on the expertise that we have developed to then support the different governments in those three mandate areas that I mentioned. Now on the infrastructure aspect specifically, we have come a long way, I believe, as an organization to try and push the reflection on infrastructure to be less siloed. You know, the infrastructure, we have to understand it really as an enabler. You know, infrastructure is a mean to achieve something else. It's an enabler for specific services. And we're really trying to push that reflection to try and stay away from looking at infrastructure only as assets, let's say a building or let's say a piece of road, because in reality, when you look at it, you can't have an asset functioning by itself. If you look at, let's say, a clinic needs water to function. So now you're going into the water and sanitation system. It needs energy and electricity. So that's another sector. It needs waste management. That's, again, another sector. So then you realize how each piece of infrastructure assets is really linked to other sectors in the same infrastructure, and that it requires, therefore, to have a look at it that is more on a system base, not on an asset base. And unfortunately, unfortunately, majority of the way governments across the world are organized is really through specific sectors: the health, the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, etc., etc. And that provides in itself challenges in looking at those infrastructure across sector, when it is actually extremely important to have this system approach, since they are all linked and interdependent. So UNOPS, I think, has come a long way in trying to push and advocate for that system thinking, and also for planning better, because in reality, The implementation side is key. Implementing is extremely important, to implement, with quality, to implement within the parameters that are set for a specific project. But planning comes first, and planning is something that we are trying to also advocate as much as possible. But my colleague will speak about that a little bit more later on.
A holistic approach is critical, isn't it? Getting everybody involved to achieve the right goals and aims, which we'll talk about later on in the program. Jibrila, thank you for that. Mukami Kariuki, World Bank Country Manager, Zimbabwe, again, welcome to the show as one of my co-hosts. Mukami, let me ask you the question. Conversation on disaster reduction is relevant and important. Why?
Well, I think we are in the midst of a disaster at this point, and I think that probably brings the point home to everybody that in the context of a disaster such as COVID-19, the important things that we then have to think about are how do we ensure that in future events of this nature, of the nature of Cyclone Idai, droughts, famine, floods, what is it that we need to do to ensure that we have in place the right policies, the right infrastructure, access to financing, to enable us not to have the types of negative impact that destabilize a country's economy and have devastating impacts on human and household livelihoods. So the reason we have to focus on disasters is for us to learn how to build back better, to learn how to set in place the instruments and the systems to avoid undue impact, especially on lives and livelihoods, and also to ensure that we build infrastructure that can withstand disasters in order for us to be able to not have to expend huge amounts of money on a regular basis to replace what has been destroyed.
Thank you. That was Mukami Kariuki, World Bank Country Manager, Zimbabwe. Thank you so much for those opening remarks. Well, there you have it. It's clear, as Jibrila has explained, that UNOPS has a unique specialization in infrastructure, and Mukami answered our question of why the conversation on disaster risk reduction is relevant and important. Now, in our next session, we explore and discuss the role of infrastructure in disaster risk reduction, critical infrastructure interdependency. I'd now like to welcome virtually our next guest and section lead, a disaster risk management specialist from the World Bank, Nicholas Callender. Nicholas, welcome to our webinar this afternoon.
Thanks very much.
Please
very
proceed.
Much looking forward to being here and speaking with you all.
Thank you, Nicholas. Maybe you could give us your comments on disaster risk management in terms of it's relevant and important to what the role of infrastructure in disaster risk reduction, critical infrastructure interdependency.
Absolutely. No, this is such an important topic. And I think Jibrila and my colleague Mukami touched on really the importance of infrastructure and infrastructure as a service as opposed to simply looking at it as an asset. And really, in the event of a natural hazard, infrastructure in itself is really quite a deciding factor in determining whether or not that situation escalates to becoming a natural disaster based on the impact on human life, on livelihoods, and on property. So, in terms of disaster risk management, while protecting life before, during, and after a natural event is the utmost priority. The impact of these events on critical infrastructure themselves that enables the basic functioning of institutions, health systems, as has been mentioned, for example, economic activity, and prevents a disruption of livelihood is also really, really critical. So proper development and maintenance of critical infrastructure and enhancing the resilience of critical infrastructure is really what we see as a core component of disaster risk reduction. And it's, we're also recognizing this as a very much urgent goal, as is reiterated in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction and other disaster risk management frameworks. At the same time, we know that climate change and more frequently experiencing and intensifying natural events, as we're seeing not just in Zimbabwe, but around the world, are really placing a lot of increased pressure on infrastructure systems to deliver these reliable services. At the same time, things like underfunding and poor maintenance result in some unreliability of infrastructure and contribute to really the vulnerability that we see in a lot of sectors in a lot of areas, especially when it comes to coping with a post-disaster situation. So, critical infrastructure, we might term, transport infrastructure, water, sanitation, energy, telecoms. These are really essential and provide critical services for the well-being of households. Yet they in themselves are quite vulnerable to natural hazards because they're often organized together in complex interlinked networks, and shocks throughout one can propagate throughout the system or propagate throughout the network quite quickly. So they're by nature very susceptible to cascading effects, and they're very highly interdependent. So disruptions in one system, again, can translate into disruptions across dependent systems and really amplify the impact of the original event. I think as Jibrilla mentioned, nothing really works in a silo, and we are taking a siloed approach to this, but we're really talking about a system of systems. So power grids, for example, that link electricity to transport, to water supply systems, telecommunications infrastructure. A disruption or failure in any of these components can cause outages across other elements of the system and make the restoration after a shock or the revamp after a shock very difficult. Urban flooding, for example, as is often experienced in Harare and other places, that's exacerbated by poor drainage systems in part, but at the same time, these types of floods can cause frequent disruptions in transport networks and energy systems, which can in turn affect telecommunications and other essential services. Sanitation systems kind of functioning at the limit or that are a bit overburdened may also mean that these floods can spread dangerous waterborne diseases and so on. So appropriately looking at and considering disaster risk reduction in infrastructure systems requires looking at the vulnerability of the critical assets, understanding the interdependencies and linkages between them and how they interact, and being able to speak to the consequences of possible disruption so that there can be better actions and better prioritization of actions and decisions. Again, there's the tendency in terms of how governments are structured, how we look at these things where we tend to look at the infrastructure sectors in isolation. And that hampers really the understanding or the ability to really notice and really appreciate and really speak to the challenges that arise from the interdependencies between them. So both in pre-disaster preparation and post-disaster recovery, it's really critical that we're able to speak to this cross-sector coordination needed by stakeholders. And in the absence of appropriate coordination and cooperation mechanisms to break through some of these silos, to see things more as a system of systems, it's more difficult to wholly and fully consider and invest in infrastructure resilience.
Thank you. That was Nicholas Callender, Disaster Risk Management Specialist from the World Bank. And of course, Nicholas will be with us throughout the show this afternoon. Honourable Deputy Minister Madiro, let me come to you. Insufficient policy frameworks can limit the participation of the private sector and, of course, partners in infrastructure development. So, as chair of the National Infrastructure Planning Committee, has Zimbabwe developed adequate policies for infrastructure that addresses climate change-related threats?
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for inviting us to this conversation. Infrastructure is widely acknowledged as a driver of economic competitiveness. Zimbabwe, like all nations, strives to meet the increasing infrastructure need in the face of sustained population growth and urbanization, changing technologies and service needs, and the social environmental ambitions of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Added to this is the urgent need for infrastructure for disaster risk reduction in vulnerable communities. The government of Zimbabwe, therefore, has set out priorities for the types of investment that will strengthen resilience and sustainability in line with Vision 2030. The collective aspirations and determination of the people of Zimbabwe are demonstrated in the National Development Strategy 1, which contains strategies, programs, and projects aimed at eradicating poverty and promoting sustainable livelihoods of the poor, women, and the youth empowerment and support to people living with disability. The key to our success has mainly been prioritization of infrastructure investment, interventions, and in the process requiring the value for money and making sure every dollar is stretched to count. In this regard, targeted approaches have ensured application and direction of the limited fiscal resources towards those priority projects with the greatest impact. Through an integrated results-based management process, the main targets for Zimbabwe include increasing urgent installed capacity for power supply, increasing access to potable water, expanding access to improved sanitation facilities with both urban and rural areas, increasing the number of kilometers of road network converted to meet STCC standards. These priorities take cognizance of the disaster risk reduction planning and implementation that cuts across all sectors in national and local level, and planning across the different infrastructural sectors. Consistent with this NDS1, the priorities for the National Public Infrastructure Investment Program for 2021 will be towards maintaining and requiring current infrastructure, complete ongoing and stored projects, whilst also investing in project development activities that will ensure we have a compendium of pipeline bankable projects. During disasters such as Cyclone Idai, infrastructure services facilitate swift response and assistance that is required to save lives. Government is prioritizing public infrastructure investment as a powerful tool in its stimulus packages, also meant to limit the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. By investing in the right infrastructure, the country not only saves lives and livelihoods, but also lays a solid foundation for a more resilient economy going forward. Consistent with this objective, government prioritizes interventions that create a supportive investment climate, improve infrastructure governance systems, and reduce construction costs, giving a more robust and streamlined approach to project preparation and execution. Together with fair and transparent procurement processes are being developed to ensure efficiency, affordability, and sustainability of public infrastructure services. The concept of building back better will be incorporated into all recovery efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. Nicholas, let me come back to you. I mean, the World Bank supports investing in people and building resilience to shocks and threats that can roll back decades of progress. Could you share with us some of the best practices or lessons learned on projects where sustainable and resilient development have been successfully implemented, where Zimbabwe can possibly learn from?
Yes, certainly. I think, just to begin, I mean, infrastructure disruptions and things like that can be chronic events. Power outages occur frequently, intermittent water supply, and sometimes these disruptions are not even due to a natural hazard, for example. Sometimes it's just challenges or difficulties within infrastructure systems themselves to meet demand and provide reliable service. So I think the first step when we think about sustainability or resilient infrastructure is to make infrastructure reliable in normal conditions, really focusing on appropriate design, operation, and maintenance. And I think the resilient building aspect of it really depends on whether or not there's effective systems in place to finance, to manage, and to inform infrastructure decision making, and also be able to maintain the assets. So I think there's an aspect certainly in terms of good governance in managing and sustainably providing good infrastructure. So I think really getting the basics right, I guess, would be the best practice to speak to your question there. So really ensuring that there are strong sort of institutional mandates and strategies in place for infrastructure resilience. Having very clear systems of regulation and clear systems for enforcement throughout the planning phases, during design and during construction. Having the right information and the right tools to make decisions. So improving decision making through good access to data and information, good access to risk information, things like flood hazard maps, having inventories of infrastructure assets, and so on. And I think importantly, ensuring that infrastructure regulations are really consistent with risk-informed land use plans. So where infrastructure is being constructed in the first place and where development is happening is guided towards safer areas and is made on the basis of informed understanding as to the risk considerations in place.
Jibrilla, you have, and you and OPS has, extensive experience in infrastructure, project development and management for disaster recovery. How does the extent of damage compare to other areas you have worked in? And do you believe that the correct approach has been taken to tackle recovery in the Eastern Highlands due to Cyclone Idai?
I think I think there's a pattern when it comes to the impacts that you would get from natural disasters. You always see that across the world. I've worked in the Caribbean specifically, where cyclone is an annual cycle. You don't think about if there will be a storm or a cyclone, but how bad it will be, right? So it's really, with now climate change, it's looking towards how bad it is getting. Now, in terms of the impact of it, it's very common in the sense that you would have landslides, you have flash flooding, as Nicolas was mentioning. You will have buildings that are damaged, infrastructure, roads, etc., being damaged, and overall services and communities' lives being disrupted. So in terms of the impact itself, I think it's quite common. Now, obviously, what we see is that the severity of those natural disasters year after year is worsening, and I think that's something that is quite a challenge, in the sense that to respond to those disasters, or to be ready for those disasters, it requires quite an amount of resources, and the planning aspect as well that we're talking about. And in a world where the fiscal space is quite short, and also ODAs in terms of support from countries for development is also limited, there is need to look at other solutions. I think we'll touch base on that on the financing aspect. But in terms of the approach that has been applied in Zimbabwe, specifically on Cyclone Idai, I'm quite happy to say that I believe it's the correct approach. Number one is because it's a multi-sectoral integrated approach, so it's really a holistic approach. I don't believe you respond to a natural disaster looking at a sectoral, just response, as we said, silo by silo. So specifically in this program, there is this multi-sectoral approach and integrated that I think is the only way to really have a resilient or sustainable impact, something that will last. And the second aspect, I believe, is that within the programs themselves, it was embedded the principles of building back better, of resilience. So it wasn't really a program. Those two programs financed by the World Bank and the African Development Banks are not directed at just rebuilding what was there before. It's not a reconstruction program. It's really, again, a program to recover from a cyclone, and to look at how we are more now resilient in the future, so that whatever schools you're building, you're not losing it with the next disaster. So I think the approach really that has been taken is the correct one. Mind you, it has its low side in the sense that it takes a little longer, however, to really implement something that will last for decades to come.
Thank you. You're watching our virtual webinar this afternoon, The Role of Infrastructure in Disaster Risk Reduction. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, UNOPS and the World Bank. Now, please remember, we'd like to hear from you. So please contact us with your questions or comments via our Facebook page, Zimpaper's TV network, and our Twitter handle @ZTN News. We will later in the program ask your questions directly to our guests or read out your comments. So please make sure they come through. We would like to hear from you. Now, next session, entitled Toward Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, Risk-Informed and Evidence-Based Approaches to Infrastructure Development and Operationalization of Resilience Strategies, we welcome our section lead, Infrastructure Advisor with UNOPS, Rob Jones. Rob, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Andy.
Well, Rob, your remarks?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. In terms of the sort of risk resilience of infrastructure and the strategies you can have against disaster, you need to understand how infrastructure exists in reality, and my colleague Jabrilla sort of mentioned this, in terms of what people see are the assets of infrastructure. They see the roads, they see the hospitals, they see the office buildings. What you don't see are the systems that they actually sit in, and how those systems actually are connected to each other. So in terms of coming up with a disaster risk resilient strategy, you need to understand the infrastructure you have in terms of the assets, then the systems that it actually it exists within, and then how those systems are connected together. Because we're very often seeing now, in terms of our studies with the University of Oxford, who UNOPS have been working with on gaining an understanding of this, is that where we get a failure in one system of infrastructure, it can very often lead to multiple failures in other systems of infrastructure. So if you lose the electricity, you lose the water, and that can affect the hospitals, the health system. You get all sorts of breakdowns occurring everywhere. So what you need to do is to understand all of the infrastructure assets you have. You need to understand the systems that they exist in, and then you need to understand the vulnerabilities and the vulnerabilities to those connections between those systems. it becomes very, very complex. And
I was going to say, it sounds very complex.
but it's best done before disaster rather than after disaster. Too often, disaster resilience planning is done after disaster. There you're only learning from what happened. You're not learning from what you think will happen and then putting the plans in place to ensure it doesn't. And that's why we keep seeing these disasters across the world. It's not just Zimbabwe, it's everywhere. And it's just a continuous problem.
Thank you. I now want to turn to Nathan Nkomo. He's Director of Zimbabwe Civil Protection Unit. Nathan, as the Director, as I said, of Zimbabwe Civil Protection Unit, how would or do you propose that development partners engage with the government to ensure that interventions for disaster recovery management are adopted by the government and sustained beyond the lifespan of the project intervention? You heard Rob saying there that disaster resilience, we can't focus on after the fact, we need to look at resilience going forward before a new disaster happens. How do you propose the government can work with development partners or other partners to ensure this?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for causing this webinar to happen. I am sure most of the issues were touched on by the Honorable Deputy Minister, but let me hasten to say government is still seized with the unprecedented damages caused by Cyclone Idai and the previous cyclones, because we have a serious backlog in terms of our recovery programs. And not to be outdone by Jibrila sitting here, he has talked a lot about UNOPS. Let me also give the architecture in which we operate as the government of Zimbabwe when it comes to disaster risk management. I am happy that we are all dealing with risk, and that risk related to infrastructure. And it's easier when you are dealing with the risk than managing the whole disaster. Our architecture is very clear. It shows that there is political will because cabinet is at the highest level, followed by a standing cabinet committee, not an ad hoc one. A standing cabinet committee composed of 17 ministries, which ministries, if you look at them, more than 6 are infrastructure-related ministries. And I am happy one of the key infrastructure ministries is represented in this webinar, Minister of Transport and Infrastructural Development. We all know the kind of value we derive from our roads and bridges, especially when you look at the epicenter of Cyclone Idai, which is Chimanimani and Chipinge. It's an area which is highly productive in terms of horticultural related products. For more than 9 months, people could not transport their produce to the market. And you can see there were lorries which were stuck in Chimanimani for 9 months, resulting in some of the produce rotting there. And that's how you then see that below that standing cabinet committee, this is where you see the technical committee. It is at the technical committee where you see the interface between government, development partners, and the private sector happening. So going downwards, right up to the district level, that's how the architecture then operates. And in terms of what you have asked the Honorable Deputy Minister on the role played by the private sector, I think without the private sector, we're going to face some difficulties in constructing some of the damaged infrastructure. His Excellency the President, as you are well aware, came up with a very brilliant idea of harnessing the support from the private sector, where the private sector companies were adopting schools, clinics for construction or rehabilitation. And it worked out wonders in looking at the speed at which we managed to recover from some of the disasters. So coming on to UNOPS and as the midwife.
And the World Bank and AFDB.
Yeah, for the World Bank and the African Development Bank. They've done a lot through their UN to UN agreements with their UN partners. And we have seen educational infrastructure, We have seen irrigation infrastructure, 18 irrigation schemes. I know government did most of them, but they have also targeted the critical ones, which were last operated, I'm sure, 10 years ago. And that's how you then see both our World Bank and the African Development Bank playing a role through their 72 million and the 25 million you have talked about. And the biggest beneficiary of those amounts I've just mentioned is the Minister of Transport and Infrastructure Development, just to indicate the importance of roads. And that was our first target. When it comes to resilience building, I am happy that various approaches are being used to realize our aspirations, as said by the Honorable Deputy Minister, of having climate smart, proved infrastructure. We now need to infrastructure climate proofing. That's now a big requirement, and it also requires new designs. There is no way we can continue using the old designs, which are now susceptible to climate change. And we have seen that happening through World Bank projects, through African development projects, and through projects being implemented by the government of Zimbabwe. About resilience building again, I think it is critical to note that every disaster is a learning curve. Before the Cyclone Idai visited Zimbabwe, we were talking about Cyclone Idai, and you would also find that even our planning for Cyclone Idai, it was based on our past experiences. Cyclone Japhet, Cyclone Idai, Cyclone Dineo, which wasn't enough because, as you said, this one caused unprecedented destruction of infrastructure, especially in the twin districts of Chipinge and Chimanimani. So resilience building, it cannot be something you learn from one disaster and say, I think we are now fully prepared for the next one. I'm sure every disaster, it tells you how then to operationalize the principle of building back better.
Honourable Deputy Minister, it appears Mr. Nathan Nkomo is saying that there are avenues for development partners to engage government, to cooperate and work together on some of these complicated issues that we are talking about today. Maybe you could elaborate, or if you have any further comment.
Well, thank you, Andy. In actual fact, what Kuman Nkomo have said is that the government, through the able leadership of our president, had clear strategies to quickly intervene to ameliorate the disaster, especially following the Cyclone Idai. You do see that the government taking the lead, but with the supporting partners coming on board and marshalling everything what was possible to save lives, at the same time to give hope and bring back the cultural community together and come out of a terrible disaster.
I suppose they also bring their knowledge and expertise and, from what previous disasters that they've been involved in, that also assist the government of Zimbabwe to put in place the right resilience strategies, etc. And that's important.
Yeah, in actual fact, the combination of the expertise of UNOPS together with the readiness and presence of government, that has seen a clear strategy to make sure that the disaster is ameliorated.
Chibula, let me come to you. Drawing on UNOPS's comparative advantage on infrastructure development, where do you see opportunities? I don't like to see that word because we are talking about a disaster, but let me use it anyway. Opportunities for UNOPS within the Zimbabwean context in this sector.
So first of all, we are a UN agency, meaning that we're here to serve, and our focus is really, to support the communities, the vulnerable communities, looking at ways we can improve the lives of the most in need. So this is really the main focus, obviously. And therefore, we come with the three mandated area of infrastructure, procurement, and project management that we have as expertise and as mandated by the UN and ratified by the General Assembly to then support in those areas. Now, I mentioned in my introductions, the specific role that we can have in implementation of projects, which is a lot of what we're doing here in Zimbabwe. And just to clarify that when I talk about implementation in infrastructure, let's say sector, I mean design, construction, supervision of construction, commissioning, operations.
The whole project management role.
Correct. That's the project, let's say, cycle I'm talking about. So in that area, there is already a lot of opportunities to improve the different stages and ensure that at each step we embed principles of build back better, but also we embed capacity building, because essentially as a UN agency, the whole point is for us to become obsolete. The whole point is for us to hand over all the knowledge as much as possible, and therefore transfer those capacity while we are engaged in supporting those projects. Now that's the implementation stage, and there are already in UNOPS extremely strong system and processes that have been developed and that are really here now to serve and to be at service to the different ministries, governments that we work in partnership with. Now, before the implementation, we need to look at planning. And I think there are a lot of opportunities, and I was very happy. I've been in Zimbabwe for a year and a half now, but I've been very happy to see, and it doesn't happen in a lot of countries, to be honest, even in developed countries. I mean, in most advanced economies, as we call it, to have already this thinking of having in place a national infrastructure planning committee, because that shows, therefore, the system thinking of infrastructure that ministries need to get together to look at infrastructure in a more holistic approach. And those processes, in reality, are processes that we have helped other governments in other countries to put in place, with technical aspect as well as institutional aspect, visioning aspects, the planning of what are the infrastructure to be in 25 years, et cetera, and then to support with some technical capacity. It could be purely engineering capacity, but it could be also legal capacity, it could be finance in infrastructure capacity that we are able to support in the planning stage. And I believe those stages are the ones where you have a greater impact. Sometimes we don't put enough emphasis to them. We put emphasis on the implementation because, essentially everybody wants to see the final product, right? But I think once you really put the efforts on the onset of those planning, and therefore you put your resources that are limited, we talked about that, really to the most impactful implementation that you have something that is sustainable, that is resilient, and that essentially has a greater impact than approaching it directly towards implementation.
I like your comment about knowledge sharing and knowledge transfer, because that's the key, isn't it? Listening to each other so that disaster resilience is built, and this doesn't, well, if it does happen again, we're ready and prepared, and the government of Zimbabwe, together with its partners, knows what to do. Nicholas, let me come back to you. Lack of routine maintenance of infrastructure contributes substantially to the deterioration and vulnerability of infrastructure assets. So, Nicholas, based on your experience, what would you recommend as best practices to ensure long-term sustainability of post-disaster rehabilitated infrastructure?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think you just spoke to a large piece of it there. I think proper investment in operations and maintenance is really critical, and the funding of maintenance often is a challenging issue, not just in Zimbabwe but experienced around the world. Typically, I think underinvestment in operation and maintenance is common because it's usually a lot easier to raise resources to finance new investments, finance a new rehabilitation or new scheme, than to cover continuous operation and maintenance costs. Maintenance is also a bit less visible than a new project or new infrastructure. But there's a lot of work that's been going into trying to understand these areas. In fact, there's a recent World Bank report that shows the value of investment in road maintenance, for example, and how much that saves in the long term in terms of new investments. So, I think, Jabrilla spoke to different pieces of the life cycle and the importance of considering resilience across them within planning processes, within the construction process. But the maintenance and operation side of the infrastructure is also as critical, if not more critical, piece there. And even if the overall vision and the overall view and the overall process during the design and construction phase was appropriate, having insufficient resources on the back end in terms of operation and maintenance would really lead to sort of low quality and low reliability. So, to speak to your question again, some good uses would be, for example, an infrastructure asset management system, right, which can be helpful in terms of a decision tool, where there's an inventory of all assets, their condition, and you can consider the strategic, financial, and technical aspects of longer-term management of assets across their life cycle. And I think that's an important place to be able to focus energy, to understand where you have best value for money in terms of placing each additional development dollar, so to speak. And then it serves as a decision support tool in terms of being able to articulate, understand the value of, and ensure that there's appropriate investments in the operations and maintenance side of things.
Thank you. Now, this afternoon, we are talking about Cyclone Idai and its devastating effects. Let us show you and remind you exactly what these were.
Cyclone Idai made landfall in Zimbabwe on 16 March 2019, leaving a trail of unprecedented destruction. The rapid needs and impact assessment that was done following the cyclone estimated that between 542 and 616 million US dollars in damages or losses had occurred across 9 districts. An estimated 865 kilometers of road and 20,354 meters of bridge were damaged by the cyclone. Power transmission and distribution infrastructure were heavily impacted, resulting in extensive power disruptions. A total of 294 health facilities were damaged and an estimated 971 schools were damaged or destroyed, impacting more than 60,000 school children. Water and sanitation facilities suffered extensive damage or destruction, increasing risk of outbreaks of diseases such as cholera. 1.4 million hectares of arable land were destroyed, and 3% of the total number of housing units in the 9 districts were damaged.
You're watching our virtual webinar, The Role of Infrastructure on Disaster Risk Reduction. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, UNOPS and the World Bank. Please remember, we would like to hear from you. So please contact us with your questions or comments via our Facebook page, Zimpaper's TV network, or our Twitter handle @ZTN News. We will later in the program hopefully ask your questions directly to our guests or read out your comments. So please make sure we hear from you. Now, in our next session, we ask, is there a gap for disaster risk reduction infrastructure in Zimbabwe? What lessons did we learn from Cyclone Idai? I'd now like to welcome our section lead, Director Nathan Nkomo from Zimbabwe's Department of Civil Protection. Nathan, you heard my question. My question is there a gap for disaster risk reduction infrastructure in Zimbabwe? What lessons did we learn from Cyclone Idai?
Thank you very much. As I said, Cyclone Idai affected almost every sector in this country, as highlighted in the last video we have been watching. And you will find that when it then affected all the 9 districts in Masvingo, Manicaland, Marsh East, and part of Midlands Province, already we had some serious backlog in terms of attending to our infrastructure, be it schools rehabilitation, wash-related infrastructure, and it even worsened our infrastructure for early warning systems for the Meteorological Services Department. Remember, they require functional radars, which were affected. And when you look at some of the dams, the dam walls were breached, and yet these are the sources of livelihoods for our own people in those areas. Some of the springs were affected, about 1,063 of them, and yet these are the sources of water for people who are practicing horticultural farming in Chimanimani. Coming to our clinics, I'm sure the statistics given in the video are very correct. As I also mentioned before, our irrigation schemes, there are now serious gaps which need to be attended. When you look at the road infrastructure, that's why of late the government of Zimbabwe decided to declare a state of disaster in relation to our roads infrastructure. You know, if you don't maintain your roads, there are so many disasters you are likely to have, including even roads traffic accidents. I'm sure you can tell from the various roads you are traversing in urban areas. Some of the accidents are there's a correlation between the number of accidents and the state of our roads. As you try to avoid a pothole, you hit into someone's car, or you end up creating an imaginary lane and you end up in serious trouble. So all the gaps are well recorded. I remember when we came up with our contingence plan for the 2020-21 rainfall season, that's when we realized that we needed about 32 million US to address all the infrastructure-related challenges we have in Zimbabwe in response to the various disasters which occurred before Cyclone Idai. As for transport and infrastructure-related projects in Chipinge and Chimanimani, in terms of rehabilitating our roads, I know last time the figure was at 1.5 billion for us to do a thorough job in addressing the transport challenges in Chimanimani. We are not only looking at the main roads, but even the feeder roads and the local authorities' roads. That's why the current emergency roads rehabilitation program 2 is focusing on that infrastructure. But when it comes to schools, I'm sure there is a figure which always indicates a serious gap of not less than 2,000 schools needed, and of not less than more than 1,000 hospitals and clinics still required. I understand when we visited Chimanimani, the Honorable Vice President was saying maybe except for Nyanga, not even a single district has got a district hospital. That indicates the type of gaps we have, especially when they are coming from such authoritative sources. I've just mentioned those few.
Just a few there, yeah. Let me turn to my other co-host for today, Mukami Kariuki from the World Bank. She's the World Bank country manager for Zimbabwe. Mukami, I want to pose the same question to you, because Nathan Nkomo has highlighted some gaps for disaster risk reduction infrastructure in Zimbabwe. So I suppose the question is, what lessons can we or should we have learnt from Cyclone Idai?
Okay, thank you. I think that's a very important question, because I think one of the principles of building back better is also to try to understand how to avoid repeat incidences that have the same level of impact. So I think in terms of the forward-looking trajectory, understanding where things went wrong in terms of the tools that are in place and what can be done to strengthen them for the future is important. So I think among those things are crisis management systems, which I believe Nathan Nkomo had mentioned with regards to the systems that are being put in place by government to deal with not just this particular disaster, but others that the country may have to attend to. And other tools that we are working with the government on right now include emergency budgeting systems, to allow the government to immediately respond to a crisis by enabling the funding that's required to flow to sectors and to locations in the country that require financing. There's also an importance in the risk insurance area of developing tools that provide for risk insurance to reduce contingent liabilities on the government itself. And I think the last area is in terms of catastrophe financing, setting up pots of money or instruments that allow funds to be unlocked and to flow for these types of disaster responses that are quick, efficient, and also lend themselves to the Build Back Better principle. And I think finally the last critical point is on the coordination of non-governmental support. So developing systems to ensure that when you have this outpouring of support, such as the one that we saw for Cyclone Idai, that there's a means for collecting all of the effort and directing it to the right locations. And I think to some extent, UNOPS has been playing that role for this program with respect to the ADB the World Bank and other financing that's been brought to the table.
Mukami, maybe you could just briefly comment on capacity building, because it appears that is also a critical component of this, is it not?
Absolutely. And I think, again, developing capacity is not something that happens within a sector or within a section of government, but it's actually all the way down from the center, the national government, all the way to community level, and putting in place training, putting in place capacity, not just training, but in terms of systems, the equipment that's required, the information tools, maybe more particularly, so for emergency communication between the center and the community, early warning systems that allow you to inform the upper levels when you hear or you see that things are starting to deteriorate at the community level. So all of those types of capacities are required. And I think, again, there are elements of the program that we have in place which are trying to develop these capacity, this capacity at the multi-tiered level within government. But the links to other programs ongoing with non-governmental organizations and with other development partners to support this risk management system are critical as well.
Thank you. Honourable Deputy Minister, I want to stick to the issue of capacity building, because supporting partner strategies call for increased support for capacity building of African countries, especially to tackle climate change related risks. What do you think should be Zimbabwe's priorities?
Well, in terms of capacity building, it is important that African countries, and particularly Zimbabwe, given the Cyclone Idai experiences, that we have technical skills in terms of building, resilient roads and bridges. Also, when it comes to construction of houses to relocate the challenged communities, there is need to have support in terms of funding and technical skills and transfer of technology to make sure that we are speedy in terms of building new structures to accommodate the affected communities.
Thank you. Nathan, let me come back to you before I bring in Jubrila. Climate change is manifesting itself, some may not agree, but I think we all agree here, it's manifesting itself in changing weather patterns. Following Cyclone Idai, of course, we looked at Cyclone Charlene, Cyclone Louise. I mean, we've had these cyclones hitting us. What proactive measures is the government taking to reduce disaster risk?
Thank you very much. I'm sure when, before Cyclone Idai visited Zimbabwe, we used to tell people to move to higher ground. But with the looming disaster from the two cyclones you have talked about, Charlene and Lois, it was a different game altogether. This time, there's no way you can talk about disaster risk management without finding somewhere safe for the people who are likely to be affected. Because if you look at our disaster risk maps, which we were assisted to develop by the World Bank and our own in-house government capacity using the Zimbabwe Geospatial Agency housed in the Ministry of Higher Education, we knew exactly where we needed to evacuate people who were likely to be affected. And taking advantage of the current pandemic, schools were closed. So it was very easy for us to improvise by using schools as our evacuation centers. So the only difference between our preparations for Idai and the two cyclones you have just mentioned was that there was now this element of having an evacuation strategy which we thought would save the lives of the people.
Jibrilla, UNOPS is involved in 2 recovery projects in the cyclone-affected communities. How are these projects addressing some of the issues that have just been highlighted by Director Nkomo?
So, you know, those 2 projects in reality are overall almost $100 million. So it's really the largest contribution that was made towards recovery of Cyclone Idai. And I believe since it's quite a large portfolio, it quite allows us to really address the different areas. And specifically, we mentioned the early warning systems, improvement or strengthening those early warning systems. We're looking at disaster preparedness. We've just started a collaboration with UNESCO, who would come in to put those systems more now, embed those into the community at the community level. So actually, I think the fact that, again, the setup of those programs was multi-sectoral and integrated allows us really to touch base on the different gaps that were raised.
I mean, before I move on to our next session, the issue here, of course, you mentioned this, communities understanding these plans. I mean, that's critical, isn't it? Because we can have all these government plans, we can have all these great blueprints, but the communities themselves need to know what to do. If a cyclone comes, they need to know that they're safe, government is there, and partners are there as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. In that sense, just a quick example, we are setting up community-based radio programs, for example, where they will be strengthened because the message sometimes also needs to be maybe translated in a manner that is also available for all to understand well what the actions are to be taken.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Infrastructure development planning, prioritization of disaster resilient infrastructure through a holistic and multi-sectoral approach is the title of our next session. Of course, my guests have been talking about this multi-sectoral approach. We cannot look at things in silos. Honourable Deputy Minister Mike Madiro, he's Zimbabwe's Deputy Minister of Transport and Infrastructure Development. Honourable Deputy Minister, disaster risk management does not only concern the Ministries of Transport and Infrastructural Development and local government and public works, but must be considered by all national institutions in their plans and budgets. Can you please share with us some of the strategies and mechanisms that the government has put in place to ensure that disaster risk management is mainstreamed across all government ministries?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. True, it is a fact that when it comes to disaster management, it requires all stakeholders to be involved and come up with a product which is a contribution of all stakeholders in the whole scheme of things. Here, if you look at the Idai experiences, you do see that the health sector, for example, where there are a lot of people who had been injured and people had died, and we had not necessarily the Ministry of Transport alone in terms of the infrastructure, but the health sector to be involved, the finance aspect of it. For example, if you are talking in terms of procurement systems, the red tape in terms of government red tape, all that had to be cut, bringing everyone to be hands-on, and the defense, for example, the security sector, had to come in to make sure that we tackle this disaster together as a systems involving everyone, including the support partners who had to come in without necessarily bringing in is to do with the protocols and what
you said the red tape, so to speak.
Yeah, red tape. So if you look at the procurement for the material to be used by the various agencies, that had to be ignored. So that we tackle efficiently, effectively, timelessly to save the situation.
Mm. Rob, let me come to you. I mean, earlier in the program, you talked about the importance of multi-sectoral approach as the best approach. So maybe you could explain to us why that is, particularly in addressing disaster recovery needs, particularly where funding is restricted.
Basically, because of making best use of the funds. I mean, if you just replace what was there, as was mentioned previously, you're going to end up with a similar result in the future very soon. Idai wasn't a particularly outstanding natural event. It was in terms of a human disaster. It was a 1 in 25 year period event. So it could happen again within 25 years. If you build back what was there before, you're going to end up with the same result in about 25 years' time.
Which you definitely don't want.
No.
Nicholas, let me bring you in. How can international funding institutions support governments with infrastructure planning?
Certainly, yes. Well, I think Thanks for your question. I think certainly there's a lot more that's done than simply the provision of financing. So we do a lot of support very much in the upstream planning process, supporting a lot of the analytical and technical work that would inform infrastructure design and planning, and really doing so across sectors. And I think, just to speak to a couple points that my colleagues mentioned earlier, in terms of supporting the government of Zimbabwe and with the tools and information for better decisions when it comes to disaster risk management. There's a lot of work ongoing now in conjunction with the Director Nkomo and the Department of Civil Protection, in terms of doing a lot of assessments that we're working closely with the government with on understanding the risk around floods, for example. So doing national level flood risk assessments and updating flood maps at a national level, really trying to develop a methodology to understand and put in appropriate decision-making tools when it comes to drought. So understanding a bit more on the nature of drought risk in Zimbabwe and then appropriate actions to take at the appropriate times. Doing a comprehensive assessment of the hydrometeorological system in Zimbabwe, as well as an early warning system that exists at the national level, but also exists at the community level, and how to develop a model that works even better that Jibrila spoke to, in terms of being able to best speak to the communities, best interact with the communities, and best provide information that's needed on a timely basis to the communities themselves. Similarly, looking to do a lot of work at the institutional level. How can we enhance even more the capacity for preparedness and response before an event, so that everything is ready and in place in the future. So I think there's a lot that we're looking at in terms of the Build Back Better principle. But to inform the Build Back Better principle, there needs to be a lot of the basis for information, the tools, the data, the information, and the understanding to inform what Build Back Better means in this specific context. I think a lot of that work is ongoing now. So, in terms of the capacity support and in terms of the collaboration that has been always great with the government of Zimbabwe, I think we're looking and making good strides in terms of both understanding the nature of the disaster risk in Zimbabwe and having the tools and information and the evidence-based approach, as was mentioned, I think, right at the beginning of this conversation, in terms of being able to take proactive and informed decisions moving forward.
Mukami, maybe I can have your brief comment on the issue of multi-sectoral approach being the best approach in terms of addressing disaster recovery needs.
Well, yes, let me say that the first point is that, especially when you're working at the community level, as was mentioned earlier, that all the infrastructure ties together. I think Nathan Nkomo had mentioned that. And so finding ways to make sure that we do an assessment of what the impacts have been, which was done in the case of Idai, down to the level of which school, how many schools were affected across the 9 districts, how many water supplies, so that you can then work with the community to then see what are their biggest pressures. And the community can then prioritize whether it's the schools, the roads, the health infrastructure that are most critical to getting them back on their feet, both from a perspective of recovering their lives and also recovering their livelihoods. And so I think the multi-sectoral approach in this particular project was organized such that UNOPS is the coordinator, but there are many UN agencies and non-governmental organizations that are working with communities and government to roll out programs that were on the ground and that were already in a position to reach the community's needs much faster than starting to build systems from scratch. So multi-sectoral approaches are important because every community is affected differently. And so we need to work with the communities, with those who are affected, to see what pressures they have and be in a position to respond. So, of course, there are some disasters that don't affect multi-sector on a multi-sectoral basis and are more contained. But in the case of Cyclone Idai, it was critical that we had an approach that was cross-cutting in this manner.
Thank you. UNOPS is...
Sorry, I'd say that cyclones are one of those types of disasters that require a multi-sectoral approach.
Okay, thank you for that. UNOPS or UNOPS is and has been on the ground in the worst hit areas affected by Cyclone Idai. Let's take a quick look at some of the projects that they are spearheading.
2 years on, the United Nations Office for Project Services, UNOPS, is helping the cyclone-affected communities to recover and build resilience through funding from the World Bank and African Development Bank. The Zimbabwe Idai Recovery Project ZIRP, funded by the World Bank, is a multi-sectoral intervention focusing on communities and community infrastructure to address the early and medium-term resilient disaster recovery needs of cyclone-affected people. The African Development Bank-funded Post-Cyclone Idai Recovery Project focuses on sustainable socio-economic infrastructure, enhancing agricultural productivity and resilience, institutional strengthening, and project coordination. Post-Cyclone Idai Recovery Project is centered on public infrastructure, including irrigation, roads, bridges, power supply, water and sanitation networks.
Jibrila, before we move on to our next session, you saw the video there, $72 million funding from the World Bank, AFDB 25 million. Maybe briefly you could explain some of the incredible work, and I can call it that bluntly, that UNOPS is doing in Cyclone Idai hit areas in Zimbabwe.
Sure, so most definitely it's not only about UNOPS. As a matter of fact, it's quite important to recognize the contribution of all the partners, including the government of Zimbabwe. Specifically under the World Bank ZIRP project that we just saw the description, it's a unique collaboration. I'm not aware of any such collaboration anywhere else in the world. I think it was a first time also for the World Bank to have a funding agency basically putting funds in one pot that is managed by one agency and then implemented to currently here 8 different agencies. The motto of the project is one team, one project. So we really look at integrating activities because we strongly believe that that integration would allow a multiplied impact rather than doing it, piece by piece. And all that allows also a more consistent management of environmental and social safeguards and also a fiduciary role. So that platform in reality has been created. It took a lot of investment effort to create that platform, in terms of the systems that are in place. And I hope, as a matter of fact, that it will serve other purposes because we see the value of such platform. Now, just a quick words on numbers, because the important again is how much we have been able to do. We are currently at a year and a half of implementation of both projects, roughly. And on the World Bank side, we have, for example, on the food security sector, more than 230,000 people that have been assisted with unconditional food assistance. We have more than 14,000 households that have been supported with agricultural and livestock inputs. Now on the health sector, more than 500,000 people received basic health services. Students, 88,000 students have benefited from teaching and learning supplies. We currently have community infrastructure that are ongoing and using a labor-based approach with 400 workers currently working on the ground. So those are just a few showcase of what is happening.
At least it shows that ZIRP is working and is getting to the people where it matters. The assistance is getting to the people. Absolutely. I think that is the key here, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. On the African Development Bank side, we have really 3 sectors that are targeted on infrastructure as well. The first one is on agricultural sector. The second one is social and economic infrastructure. So those are more, let's say, the bridges and really the road and transport, etc. And then on the third side, we're looking at really the disaster preparedness. A lot of capacity building, procurement of tool and equipment that has already been handed over to different ministries and the departments of the government. So we see, I think, good progress, although we would like to have more. Obviously, the important is to get those services and to get those implementation done so that the population and the communities that were affected.
I mean that's the key, and one of the reasons for this program is to sensitize people that more resources are needed, more effort is needed by everybody, not just the government of Zimbabwe, but partners, public sector and everything. And this is why we are here. In fact, that takes me now to our next session, which is where we look and further explore the financing for disaster resilient infrastructure. What are the opportunities and challenges? Honourable Deputy Minister, in the face of the growing threats of disaster, I mean, you yourself mentioned, and Rob mentioned, once in 25 years, but it could unfortunately happen tomorrow in that case. What are some of the strategies and mechanisms put in place by the government of Zimbabwe for investment in disaster risk reduction?
Thank you, Andy. In terms of planning for disaster management, the government of Zimbabwe has seen it fit to ensure that in disaster-prone areas like Chimanimani, for example, that people are settled in higher ground, which is less risky in terms of future disasters. You are aware that communities usually want to remain where they are because of traditional linkages and heritages, and the conscientization of the people to understand the risks involved in terms of future disasters. Like my colleague have said that every cycle of 25 years, disaster are likely to occur again. And the government has put strategies to make sure that people understand that they need to move and leave some of their connections and cultural and connections and live in higher grounds. And also to ensure that when it comes to projects, in agricultural projects, they may travel to their respective economic activities rather than stay at the same places, and ensure also that they build more resilient structures rather than the usual point Dhaka, which can easily be destroyed when disasters come into place. So the government is also putting a strategy where resources are put in place for immediate intervention when it requires to do so, rather than taking time in terms of planning, but to close the gap between planning and implementation, and involving everyone in terms of a sustainable systems approach where every other stakeholder comes into play.
Jubila, Nathan did mention earlier about the private sector being critical in terms of Cyclone Idai, and of course private-public partnerships are also important. But what are some of the criteria used by public-private partners in terms of assessing eligibility for infrastructure funding?
So first of all, I think I would like to underline the importance of private sector involvement. I think the Secretary General himself has mentioned it, that achieving the SDGs is impossible without the strong involvement of the private sector. And all countries, I think, have started a long time already to get the policies in place in country and the framework that are necessary for private sector investments. Now, in terms of criteria, first we have to recognize that private sector is based on profit margin making. So the project needs to be bankable. So as a criteria number one, there needs to be a return on investment. For that to happen, the studies, the analysis, the pre-investment studies that can take place are extremely important. As a matter of fact, those are areas also where UNOP supports several governments as, let's say, an impartial and very neutral party. That's different than having, let's say, a private sector consultant firm undertaking some of those analyses. So we try and support those aspects, and looking at also the trust aspect. The trust is extremely important in the sense that those investments are long-term investment, 25, 50 years, period. So the trust is extremely important. So while the institutional framework is key to be in place, it's extremely important also to have the key partners that are in place to look at those projects and ensure that they are bankable.
Nicholas, you have had, and the World Bank has had, extensive experience in disaster risk management. Can you briefly share with us some of the successful models for PPPs for investment in disaster risk reduction needs, and what Zimbabwe can learn from them?
Yes, certainly. So, I think when it comes to public-private partnerships, and really just to reiterate what Jubila mentioned in terms of the importance of private financing when dealing with this and in disaster management, and post-disaster finance is one of the main issues faced by a government. So, within a PPP arrangement, there's a potential to address some of the insufficient funds that you would find in a context like that by increasing the participation of private actors. And just to go back to, I think, what was discussed at the beginning of this conversation, where we spoke of infrastructure as a service as opposed to looking at infrastructure as an asset. And I think that's where there's a very large opportunity in terms of the private sector engagement, in terms of ensuring the resilient service provision as opposed to the resilience of the asset in itself. So how to make sure where it makes sense for service continuity to be guaranteed. And I think the other opportunity within a PPP is that it's an opportunity to sort of reorient some of the incentives that may not work so perfectly in terms of this service provision. So, for example, a roads agency that operates with a fixed budget, there's an incentive to build roads in a way that would minimize the maintenance costs and the repair costs. And there's not so much concern over the impact or the challenges around impeded service delivery, or what that impact would have on businesses or supply chains or other domains within these clustered networks, as we've spoken about before, in terms of these interdependencies amongst infrastructure. So, whereas the incentives would be very different in terms of paying for a service, whereby service provision and the provision of this, guaranteeing the provision of the service is really key. In that sense, the incentives there to avoid revenue losses and to factor in those maintenance and repair costs and all of that, because that ultimately is the incentive structure that will be in place there. So I think in terms of where this best fits, again speaks to the understanding of these critical interdependencies, where these linkages are, where the pain points and the challenges are, and then where it makes sense for an adjustment of incentives with the private sector approach included in terms of a complement to public sector assets and investments in public assets.
Thank you, Nicholas. The next session is where we hear directly from you. We have received a few questions from you, our viewers. Thank you very much for them, and we will ask directly to our guests straight after this. Now you're watching our virtual webinar, The Role of Infrastructure on Disaster Risk Reduction. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimbabwe's TV network, ZTN, and our partners, UNOPS, and the World Bank. Let me just, there's a few questions we've asked. As I said, thank you very much to our viewers. Honourable Deputy Minister, let me start with you. The question is, communities are still living in tents 2 years after Cyclone Idai. What are some of the challenges the government has faced, and how can development partners provide support?
Thank you, Andy. It's true that we still have people living in tents in Chimanimani, in Gangwi in particular. The main challenge has been funding to speed construction of houses to relocate those intents. And from the development partners, what as government would probably want is financial support to ensure that we have the capacity to speed the construction of houses to relocate those people.
Jibrila, you mentioned this earlier, and I want to come back to it, or rather one of our viewers has. And the question is, does building back better make sense if it means that communities must wait longer for project completion?
That's a very important question, I think, because it touches really, to the core of the days or the lives of the communities that have been affected. And I would say, in essence, would you rather wait for 6 months for your school to then function for the next 10 and 20 years, or have it immediately and maybe have it disrupted every year? So it comes down to that, right? There is a compromise that needs to be made. And infrastructure is a long-term investment. You don't build infrastructure to last 1 year. And in reality, once those infrastructure are established, never mind the way they were planned, whatever mistakes have been embedded in those infrastructure will remain with them for decades to come. Again, fiscal space, etc., investment will go towards new infrastructure, not necessarily rehabilitating or reshaping a wrongly thought or wrongly planned infrastructure. So I think it definitely makes sense. We're not anymore in the areas of quick fix and patches, but I think it's extremely important that indeed what you do when you do it right from the first time. It does have that compromise, as I said. In that sense, I think that the ZERP program was well thought through, because it was divided into two components, with the first component being really the emergency responses, the immediate needs with the food security, the basic health services, etc., etc. And there was a second component that was already planned from the onset to be kind of the medium to longer term component. And we understand that one takes a little longer.
Nathan, I'm going to ask you a direct question from one of our viewers. Is Zimbabwe disaster prepared?
Thank you very much. Let me also add my voice to your first question to the Honorable Minister. Yes, the issues of financial constraints played an important role. But however, remember when we started looking for sites to relocate our people in Chimanimani, we had 6 of them, which we subjected to some geophysical surveys just to assess their suitability for relocating the internally displaced people. So that on its own, we ended up settling on 2 areas. That's the West End and the Flats. And that also took a long period of time. And given the magnitude of Cyclone Idai, I'm sure we spend a lot of time doing emergency relief than the recovery side of things. So your question now on
is Zimbabwe prepared? Because that's a critical question, isn't it?
On preparedness. Yeah. Let me say preparedness is a function of several factors, and it's not an event. You cannot say in 2021 we are prepared for the next 10 years. It's not possible. So preparedness is a function of your functional structures which you have, because you can have structures which are not functional. But fortunately here in Zimbabwe, our structures are functional. And one lesson we learned from Cyclone Idai is that we need to cascade the various platforms right to the village level. Why? Because the villagers are the first responders to any disaster. What we now need is to give them more capacity through training, using proceeds or using assistance from our development partners. I know those are the areas they are mostly interested in when it comes to capacity building. Very few, except for IOM, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank we are talking about here, are interested into hard issues, into infrastructure. So as we speak, IOM is constructing some transitional shelter for the people who are living in tents now, so that we decongest the tents with the holding camps by relocating all the people to the West End.
So this will be happening soon, hopefully.
Right. Then the other issue, in terms of preparedness, you look at your equipment, you look at, do you have suitable equipment? For 5 days when Cyclone Idai came, it took us a lot of time to visit the injured people. We need machinery. We need suitable machinery. We need trained personnel. We need to harness technology. Now people are using drones and everything. And we also need to come up with an evacuation strategy which is very clear. If you look at
and is understood by the communities as well. Sorry, Director Nkoma, I have to leave it there. Nicholas Mukami, I want to just give you just a brief time just for your final thoughts. Nicholas, I suppose you can talk about very briefly if the PPP is the preferred model for financing infrastructure projects. That's one of the questions. As I said, I can only give you and Mukami a brief time to answer. Nicholas?
Sure. I think I think in terms of speaking to a point that Director Nkomo was just making, and the question posed in terms of is Zimbabwe disaster prepared, and I think it's one of those questions that it's is Zimbabwe on the road for disaster preparedness? There's no country or no place that is entirely prepared that's bulletproof. And the question is, are things being improved? Are things being put in place? Are measures being taken so that in the next event the capacity to respond is greater? In the interim, having the tools and information to be able to make better informed decisions when it comes to infrastructure planning or any other development planning, are those getting ready? And I think in that regard, Zimbabwe is well on the way, both in terms of focus on the institutional preparedness framework, as well as having the tools and information and the technical capacity and know-how, and constantly building on what exists already and is in place in country. So it's always great to see that happening. So in tandem with the programs that the World Bank has financed in terms of the ZERP and the African Development Bank, it's also important that while the reconstruction recovery is happening, that we also focus on the preparedness and the capacity to be able to make better decisions from a development standpoint, and also be able to respond in a much more comprehensive, holistic, and effective way each and every time an event occurs.
Thanks, Nicholas. Mukami, I can only give you a little bit of time because we are coming to the end, but I don't have a question for you, but I just thought very briefly your final thoughts.
Thank you very much, Andy, and it was very good to be part of this panel. I think that the last few points I'd like to make is, firstly, that the World Bank is committed and will remain engaged in Zimbabwe on helping to have sustained development impact. So going forward, preparedness will be key. And I wanted to say that climate change is one of the factors that we will start to need to pay more close attention to. And this year with the COP26, which is the event in November, which will bring together all countries around the globe to see what can be done to accelerate action towards the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, both geared towards trying to ensure that we're ready and prepare ourselves to handle better climate impacts in the future. And for Zimbabwe, the adaptation focus, which government is now working to build into its NDCs, the nationally determined contributions towards these plans, will be important for us to pay attention to at the community level in order for us to ensure that we have in place systems, activities, and we adjust our livelihoods, adapt them, in other words, to climate change impacts that are going to be with us in the near future. So I think just wanted to say thank you very much for the opportunity.
Oh no, it's a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you for giving us your time and participating. I'd also want to thank you all out there, the viewers of ZTN, for all your questions and comments we received via our various platforms. Rob, I can only literally give you just a few seconds. Homegrown solutions, they're critical, are they not? And that this also does this also apply to infrastructure projects, infrastructure development?
I mean, the answer is, I'm afraid, yes and no. It has to be entirely context. It's contextual. What's the system of infrastructure? What's the vulnerability? What's the failure point? It has to be built for every single infrastructure system individually.
Unfortunately, I wish we had so much. There's so much we can discuss about Cyclone Idai and the fact that we cannot forget it. 2 years on, it seems to have disappeared, as I said, from our consciousness. It must come back into it. Now we have come to the end of, frankly, a very important webinar and discussion on the effects of Cyclone Idai on Zimbabwe citizens, its infrastructure, if Zimbabwe is prepared for future disasters, and how we can now and in the future not only finance disaster relief today, but also put in place sustainable and effective financing mechanisms. So if any future disaster occurs, which of course we truly hope does not, Zimbabwe will be prepared. We have come to the end of our webinar this afternoon. You've been watching our virtual webinar, The Role of Infrastructure in Disaster Risk Reduction. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, UNOPS, or UNOPS, and the World Bank. I'd like to thank our guests and, of course, my co-hosts this afternoon, Honorable Mike Madiro, Zimbabwe's Deputy Minister of Transport and Infrastructure Development, Mr. Nathan Nkomo, Director of Zimbabwe's Civil Protection Unit, my co-hosts, Jibrila Mazin, Country Manager, UNOPS, and Mukami Kariuki, World Bank Country Manager, Zimbabwe, and of course, Rob Jones, Infrastructure Advisor with UNOPS, and Nicholas Callender, Disaster Risk Management Specialist at the World Bank. Thank you, all of you, for appearing on our program this afternoon. A final thought. Please don't forget the effects of Cyclone Idai and our fellow citizens that tragically suffered because of it, and some are to this day still suffering. We need all of us to redouble our efforts to assist them, and furthermore, Zimbabwe must be prepared so that in future, if disaster strikes, we will be ready. I'm Andy Hodges. Have a good afternoon and goodbye, and you all be safe.